Welcome everyone to this edition of Lynk Speaker Session, where we'll be having a conversation about emerging business opportunities in Japan and the country's economic recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. I'm Isabel Wong, Lynk Studio Lead and the host of this speaker series. Lynk Speaker Session is brought to you by Lynk Global, a technology platform that powers the new knowledge economy by unlocking insights and using technology to organize experts and their expertise. Lynk has been intelligently connecting decision makers and business leaders with over 780,000 experts across regions and industries to help them make better informed decisions. Now, going back to the main topic of this session, foreign investors were largely optimistic about Japan's recovery from the coronavirus pandemic just more than a month ago, but analysts have said recently that the resignation of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe could stifle foreign investment flows in the near term due to uncertainty about how policies will play out and the potential return of Japan's short-lived premierships. Some reports even say Japan's odds of getting those capital flows are now much lower. Meanwhile, Japan's new Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga and his cabinet kicked off with very high approval ratings, with 74% of Japanese residents polled expressing approval of Suga's administration. Having been regarded as an insider and one of the key architects of Abenomics, Suga has vowed for an extension or continuation of the overall macro policy framework, which encompasses both expansionary fiscal as well as monetary policies in Japan. But the immediate focus for Suga's cabinet, as many have said, will be reviving the battered economy while keeping the coronavirus under control. And longer-term challenges also include the country's falling birth rate and simmering tensions with Asian neighbors. So do the Japanese population and foreign investors view Japan's leadership change differently? And where can investors find bright spots in the Japanese markets in the near term? Joining us today to shed some light on the potential outlook of the Japanese economies is Melanie Brock, CEO of Melanie Brock Advisory and Non-Executive Director of Sega Sammy Holdings. Melanie is also one of Japan's most sought-after APAC specialists who holds active advisory roles for the Australian and New Zealand Chamber of Commerce in Japan. To make this conversation actually more truly interactive for our audience members today, we are going to run a poll to learn a bit more about what is the most critical challenge our audience members think Japan's new Prime Minister and his cabinet should be prioritizing addressing at this moment. But now please bring up the poll. The question for all of you is, what is a critical challenge facing Japan that Yoshihide Suga's cabinet should prioritize tackling? You've got the options of A, COVID-19 response, B, economy and jobs, C, pensions, medical and nursing care, D, fiscal consolidation, and E, foreign relations. Now, just spend the next 20 seconds or so. Go ahead and vote in the poll. We'll share the poll results later in the session so you get to understand what your audience members think also. And Melanie and I will also try to craft the session around some of the topics that you're most interested in. But a little bit of instruction in terms of how to ask questions later on. Before we begin the conversation, if you would like to submit any questions to Melanie later on, please feel free to use the Q&A function on Zoom, or if you're dialing in from your mobile, you could also send us your questions at insight@linkknowledge.com. We'll go through some of the questions that you have in our Q&A section later. But now, without further ado, let's bring in our speaker of the day, Melanie Brock, CEO of Melanie Brock Advisory and Non-Executive Director of Sega Sammy Holdings. Melanie, thank you so much for joining us today from Tokyo. We have a lot of questions for you because with the new political leadership and challenges coming from COVID-19 outbreak, could you please give us an overview as for what are some of the changes that you have spotted in the Japanese business sector and the market so far? What are some of the opportunities that you anticipate there will be in Japan as the country goes through some of the transformation that has never been seen before? Welcome.
Thanks, Isabel. And first of all, just want to say thank you to everybody at Lynk. we talked about having a session on Japan. And at the time, of course, we wouldn't have been able to predict that the then Prime Minister would resign due to ill health, of course, and that we would have a new government in place to discuss. So it's very timely, I guess, that we are now looking at Japan and as you say, what and how it will tackle these critical issues. When I look at that poll, I find it very difficult to sort of separate out which I would see as more important and worthy of consideration in terms of priority, because I think they're equally as important. But I think we should aim to send the poll on to the Prime Minister afterwards and to give him a sense that these are some of the things that people in the region are thinking about. The only other thing I was going to say is that I'm certainly, I know that Lynk's business is all about connecting people through expertise, and I don't feel like an expert on Japan at all. My only claim to fame is that I've been here for such a long time, and nearly 30 years now. And I see myself as much more of a generalist, so I apologise in advance for any lacking in terms of depth of knowledge or expertise, for sure. The Japanese experience this year, of course, is very different to what we've experienced in the past. Although the resilience that the Japanese people and the Japanese government to a certain extent have demonstrated throughout previous years is definitely on display here in Japan throughout this pandemic. Japan describes the pandemic in a very interesting way, I think, in that it says it's with corona. And so it's a discussion a lot of the time about how things change, how new world and the new normal that we describe in the West, I think, is going to be played out with corona while we're waiting for a vaccine or further advances in terms of medical support and what have you. And of course, then there's a lot of discussion about after corona. There tends to be a bit more focus about with corona at the moment, because that's driving some of the discussions about what can happen in the economy, how the economy can change to support the citizens and the businesses that are taking a real hammering at the moment. You know, there's been great criticism, I think, within Japan towards the Japanese government, especially in the earlier stages, for being a little slow to act, I think. In many ways, some of the level, like the testing, for example, is very difficult to access. There are still only several thousand of tests being conducted every day, and compared to the situation in Australia, for example, that's very low. But obviously, if you look at the results of just the stats and the pure numbers, at the moment, we're seeing about 1,500 deaths in Japan, which makes the death rate very low compared to other countries. And there are about nearly 80,000 confirmed cases. What that has meant is that people are very mindful of just general hygiene. Obviously, the Japanese government called an emergency measure and set that in place for about 6 weeks in April and May. But we just had a long weekend, and a 4-day long weekend, which was glorious. And for the time that the weather was fantastic, people were out in droves. My son and his family and in-laws all went into the countryside and experienced 4-hour time, you know, like traffic jams and the like. And so it's very clear that the economy wants to get going, and people are looking at how, with corona, they can go on about their business. But it's a very different Japan that we're now grappling with. Many people are working at home. Many people are obviously suffering from some of the terrible impact and ramifications, the societal issues with domestic violence, with suicide on the increase. There are some real challenges for the Japanese government, and it's obviously not just an economic issue, but that's a major focus for this government. When you look at some of the surveys that have been taken, even in as late as August, the majority of people are dissatisfied with the way that the support has been provided. Early on, people would be familiar with the term Abe no mask. A lot of money was spent on these masks that were so called, you know, saving the Japanese people and what have you, and they appeared and they were too small, or they didn't get delivered and the like. So there has been a lot of criticism. Throughout that time, of course, the then Prime Minister's approval rate and the approval rate of the Cabinet was very low as well. That, as Isabel mentioned, changed dramatically when the then Prime Minister resigned and Prime Minister Sega took up the reins. I don't think that's necessarily an indication of anything other than a great keenness on the part of the Japanese people to see change take place, and perhaps a new pair, a new set of eyes, a different look might bring that for people. I think that it's been the weaknesses that might have been displayed in the Japanese economy, or in the work style, or how people do business, perhaps, i.e. a very low level of digitisation, for example. That has been driving some of the areas where there might be some opportunities for people in the future, but there's definitely reason for change in Japan. Of course, in the early days, not being able to go to work meant that a lot of people had to rely on, their computers. Not everybody had a laptop. In surveys just recently, people have said that only 20% of the people believe that they have, appropriate Wi-Fi in the home. So there are a lot of reasons to look at why Japan needed to move forward. And so the catchphrase is really all about digital transformation, how that will not only raise Japan's productivity, but allow people to access services in an easier and an online fashion, which has always been interesting, I guess, looking in from outside in Japan, that people assume that everything's very digital and that everything's just high tech. And in fact, some of the very analog structures are holding back reforms, and they're also holding back a lot of investment, I think, in Japan. We went up to the bank today, and I'm telling you right now that Japanese banks, that's an area where, it is open for reform. And I think the digital transformation will be seen in areas like fintech and in the traditional banking sectors more than anywhere else. So that will definitely move on very quickly. At this stage, only about 30% of the Japanese workforce are working from home. A lot of the services sector, the medical, teachers, for example, there are a range of people, production, factory staff, etc. A lot of people can't work from home, and so they are already moving to having to be in a sort of semi-hybrid system, I think, where they are required to go to work in offices and the like. But this has caused, I guess, some stress for people, and obviously the companies have looked at how they can manage people coming back. More of the foreign companies, of course, under global sort of management and the like, have got different structures in place. And so I think that it's interesting at the moment to see how Japan will grapple with the full return to work, or how they will manage this work from home style that will help, hopefully, give some relief to some of the families who have sort of said, that they're loving having their dad at home. And even the dads are saying, I've never been able to spend as much time with my kids. This is fantastic. What you would hope, of course, is that as a result of the digital transformation and reforms in the working style and how companies manage staff, that people will have access to services, that they will have more flexibility, and that those families will be able to benefit from that, whatever shape that family takes. Obviously, it's a very different looking Japan, albeit that people are out and enjoying themselves. The tourists are not here. Only a few people were able to enter Japan, and of course they're not tourists at this stage. So an industry that is very, very important to Japan. Pre-pandemic, as many as 30 million tourists were visiting Japan. They're not here. So a lot of the hospitality sector, hotels, it has a great impact on those sectors. And of course, it has an impact on the rolling out of plans to move ahead with the integrated resorts. But we'll come back to that. I think we've got some questions around that. It's very sad, of course, to see the number of bankruptcies. I just saw a report today that said that there are 500 larger companies listed. But of the 3 million SMEs that operate in Japan throughout the various prefectures, as many as 300,000 have gone under. And I hear from people some stories that, people sort of just feel that they won't open the doors again, and I think that's happening in a lot of different countries. But some of those businesses have been doing it tough for a very long time in the regional areas of Japan, and so that's particularly distressing. I do sense, though, that there's sort of a little bit of optimism, odd optimism. I don't know that people are jumping for joy at this stage, of course, and Isabel, you painted a very grim picture in your introduction. But, you know, the OECD projection is for 5.8%, you know, the labour market. We haven't seen the unemployment figures increase dramatically at this stage. Of course, the way that they're reflected in Japanese stats is very different to, say, other countries. Consumption is picking up. Today, the Bank of Japan suggested that business sentiment reports that will be released fairly soon are showing that there's an increase in sentiment, and that people are sensing that there's just a little shift. And as I said, you know, when I look at the TV reports on the weekend and you see the pure joy on the face of many of the hospitality sector workers, where they said that their small Japanese inn had, you know, close to 100% occupancy. It's sort of been a very long time for them living without any support. And so you sort of welcome their return to a better situation, that's for sure. The Nikkei itself, you know, if you look at the pre-pandemic level at about, well, 24,000 yen, it's now sitting, today it was around 23,000. And so that's a good sign, I guess. You just want for some of those companies to be passing that on in the form of support to their staff and the like. So that's also, I think, very important. Obviously, as I mentioned before, some of the social policy reforms, or rather attention that needs to be given to areas in Japan, would include, you know, proper gender policies and the like, ensuring that some of the, you know, the many women who were engaged in part-time work mostly pre-pandemic, and of course were the first to lose their jobs and the like, that they are supported back into the workforce through training and other measures that the Japanese government might consider. You know, you mentioned the demographics. You know, I think I saw a stat yesterday that said that 1 in 5 women in Japan is over 70. You know, that means that, you know, there's an aging population that has to be dealt with. And so when the Prime Minister was asked, or when the survey was issued immediately after the Prime Minister was elected, the first issue is coronavirus and response to that. The second is the economy. And the third, which is always very high, is the pensions and the social sort of support that the country knows that it has to provide, such that all of the young people aren't paying for all of us old people to do what we do, which is grow old gracefully, hopefully, at some point. I think in terms of how Japan grapples with this so-called new normal and with corona, Japan is looking at how it might attract some of the business from potentially Hong Kong. It would like to see that Tokyo be given the status of a sort of a financial capital. A lot of work is being done at the moment, I think, at the Tokyo Metropolitan Government level, looking at how that might happen. But of course, we know that the current tax regime and the inheritance tax and some other measures that are levied against foreign talent makes it very difficult for companies to move forward with their any decisions to bring people in. So that's obviously of great consideration. But I look at the decision by Warren Buffett to buy big in Japan, particularly looking at taking a position in those trading houses. And I think there's a long-term investor with a long-term view. He's probably in it for a very good reason. Some of those business opportunities might present themselves, I think, in terms of how we access the opportunities that come from the digital transformation that will take place. I think the healthcare sector is something that will be very a keen interest for a lot of our companies overseas. Of course, they have to localise their product and services such that it suits the Japanese consumer. But I think any product that seeks to provide a service in a way that's productive and localised and suited to the Japanese market will definitely do very well. there's a major shift to cashless. I've seen more cashless payments in the last sort of 2 or 3 months than I would ever imagine we would in Japan, with everything being such a strong cash culture. But that's very interesting for some of our bigger financial industries, I think. Space development is something that I think people should consider. The Japanese government's putting a lot of effort and investment into space, into energy. Japanese companies are looking at how they can invest in cleaner energy and how they can be a bigger player in the renewables sector as well. The travel industry, I think, is interesting. Japan's using this downtime to look at the ways that they can adjust and amend the airport layout and structure, such that, you know, tests can be given to people when they arrive and very quickly move them on and the like. And so there'll be some interesting sort of AI, you know, robotics, delivery systems that get put in place, but also testing regime, I think, will really, really pick up. In terms of geopolitical situation, that's a very tricky, you know, issue for me to comment on with any clarity, I guess, because we've got an election in the United States coming up. We have a ever simmering tension between the United States and China. But a lot of these issues will, you know, if you take a long-term view, you know, it's probably going to be the issue of the century, the US-China battle. So we probably have to learn how to manage it. And that's where I think Japan does manage it, its neighbour and relations with its neighbour very well. The commercial relationships with Japanese companies, of course, are second to none. And so I think some countries, including my own, would do well to look at how Japan works with its neighbours in the region and learn lessons from that. If you're to look at where Japan Inc. is putting its money, I think you only have to see where the foreign minister travelled to recently. He visited Thailand, Malaysia, and of course he went to the United Kingdom to push the UK Stilton cheese trade agreement along a little there. But you know, for Japan and Japan Inc., there's great interest in developing the linkages and business connections with India, Indonesia, Myanmar, Malaysia, Thailand, and of course in recent times in the Pacific as well, which I think is all very, very interesting. A lot of the focus is, of course, on the new Prime Minister, and I didn't want to say that he's a strawberry farmer who likes pancakes again, because I think I've heard that 1,000 times already, but it is in fact true. He is the son of a strawberry farmer. I think more importantly, he is not he doesn't come from a long line of political sort of experts or figures. And when you hear how he travelled as a young man to Tokyo, defying his parents who wanted him to take over the farm, to hear him talk about how he got a job, he learnt a lot about some of the pressure that the labourers had. He saved up enough money to go to a university and then became, you know, a politician later in life. It does give you a glimpse into the man, I think, who is very focused on making changes that he can change. And I think you'll see a raft of domestic-based, Japan-based reforms that he pushes very hard in the next little while. There's a lot of speculation about when he, of course, will call the election. Some people are saying November. I think that'll play out depending on how quick he is to demonstrate to the voting public that he has the capacity to be more than just a caretaker or an interim Prime Minister. I think he's very interested in determining what those areas are and making sure that they're delivered quickly in a way that's not only effective, but that it sets up precedents that he can then use to bring on more reforms after that. One of the areas that he's talked about since becoming Prime Minister is mobile phone bills being reduced. Now, I really hadn't realised that my mobile phone was any more expensive than anywhere else. But now that I think about it, now that he said it, I'm thinking, well, move that on as quickly as you possibly can, because any reduction at the moment where you've got people on very reduced salaries in many cases and difficult circumstances where people are relying on their savings and the like, I think that it'll be very welcomed by the Japanese people. He interestingly set the previous defence minister up in a role of sort of a minister who will have a portfolio to overlook some of these administrative reforms that need to take place. And Minister Kono, very amusingly, tweeted out, please call me or call the organisation, the ministry, with any of your concerns or any ideas that you might have. And I think it was, remarkable. They got, 4,000 inquiries and had to close that option straight away. I was going to send some in, but it closed before I even got a chance to. But when it opens up again, I'll be sending in my ideas about Japanese banking, that's for sure. But I think it's an indication that the government means business, and that they will want to move quickly to get the support of people such that they can then go to an election, and the mandate that then Sega will have will allow him to build more reforms that are obviously are very much necessary, and are an extension of Abenomics in many ways, those structural reforms that we expected to see. So I think the government will look at its foreign policy in a similar vein. The United States is a very important and the most important partner for Japan, given the defence shield that it provides Japan. But other middle powers like Australia, for example, we believe that the Quad talks will be taking place in early October. So the focus on India, the United States, Australia and Japan is very much considered at the moment. So I think you'll see a focus on deregulation, reform and results. I know that there is a ongoing commentary in the West mostly about the revolving door nature of the prime ministers prior to Shinzo Abe. But I think if you spoke to Suga today, he'd be very, very sure that he does everything now to make sure that he's not part of that revolving door. So I might leave it on that note. I had other things that I wanted to talk about, but of course I missed those, but we might leave it and take it as more of a Q&A if that suits you, Isabel.
Sure. Thanks, Melanie, for the overview just now. But now, before we continue the conversation, let's go back to the poll we did earlier to check out what are some of the most critical challenges that our audience thinks Yoshihide Suga's cabinet should be addressing immediately. Now, 53% of our audience members think economy and jobs should be the most critical issue, and then that's followed by 24% of our audience thinking that COVID-19 response. And then the third most critical challenge that our audience members think the cabinet should be addressing would be pensions, medical and nursing care, and then foreign relations, and the last one would, out of all the options, would be fiscal consolidation. So yeah, indeed, as you mentioned, Melanie, those are some like equally critical and challenging problems that Suga's cabinet would have to work on very soon. But now, again, before we go back to the conversation, we have another question for everyone. After listening to Mel's overview of how Japan is coping with so many changes and challenges at the moment, could you please bring up the poll? The second question for everyone here is that where do you see bright spots in Japan? So you've got the options of A, gaming, B, food delivery, C, healthcare, D, casino and gambling, and E, digital payments. So we could just spend the next 10 seconds or so. Some of these sectors actually Melanie has mentioned earlier already, but then if you guys would like to know more about any of these sectors, please feel free to send in your questions, and then we can go a little bit more detailed into either one of the sectors if you would like to. But now, we'll go back to this, the results of this poll at the end of the session. But I would like to continue the conversation with Melanie first about Japan's new prime minister. Of course, there are so many areas for discussion, basically. But the first one I would like to ask about is that Japan's new prime minister, Suga-san, comparing to former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, he is actually seen as a very savvy politician on the domestic front who has been actually doing the work of executing Abenomics, but not so much experienced in terms of diplomatic affairs. So this is basically what other people have been saying about him so far. So how do you envision Suga-san will be handling diplomatic ties, given his inexperience in terms of diplomatic issues? Some of the countries of interest, of course, will be about Japan-US relations, its relationship with China, also South Korea, and one of the countries that we would also like to know about is whether or not, given the whole US-China tensions going on, if it would actually bring, let's say, countries such as Australia and Japan a bit closer. Like, how do you envision Suga-san will be doing this?
Yeah, there's a lot of commentary about the fact that the Prime Minister doesn't speak English, I believe that to be the case. But I don't think that'll hamper him. Obviously, it means that in the sidelines of any G20 or UN General Assembly discussions and the like, where there might be side conversations that he would have to rely on interpreters. Prime Minister Suga has been with Abe as you said in your introduction, the sort of architect of a lot of policy and in Japan, both foreign and domestic based. So I wouldn't have any concern. In fact, I believe that he is very capable. He's an extremely diligent and intelligent person. So he will do all of the research, all of the prep, all the management, and he knows the policies. The other thing people quite often say is, oh, what is Suga like? And I think, well, he was in fact the Chief Cabinet Secretary, which meant that for 7 years and 8 months, he was in front of the media 2 times a day. So, I mean, if diplomats and business people can't get a sense of a person in that time, there's something wrong with, the lens that they might have of him. I think he'll be I think he's got issues at home here in Japan that he has to deal with, as we've said, and as your poll points to as well. But I do think that people are underestimating the capacity and the capabilities of the Prime Minister vis-a-vis foreign policy. I think the fact that he sent a letter to the South Korean president immediately, calling for good relations, was a solid attempt. I think the early support of his appointment by the Chinese government was also very much welcome. I know that on the Sunday night, the Prime Minister spoke with President Trump and raised the issue of the North Korean abductees, which is, of course, a very important issue for Japan. And he also spoke to Prime Minister Morrison. And so I think that bodes well. He's spoken to Angela Merkel yesterday and some others as well during the week. He's got a busy agenda, but I certainly don't think that he's going to suffer in areas. He's got a very strong cabinet, albeit mostly men. But I feel quite sort of optimistic and oddly interested to see how things plan out. Yeah.
Yeah, following up on what you just mentioned, of course, Suga-san's cabinet is mainly formed by male government officials. And in fact, inside the cabinet, there are actually just 2 female officials, which is 1 less than Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's cabinet. So, which brings me to ask you the following question, because some commentary and analysts, they have actually said one area that Abenomics has not been very successful so far is in increasing the participation of fathers in childcare. While both men and women had seen reductions in the long work hours, for which Japan is kind of notorious about, improvement in narrowing the gender pay gap has been slow, especially in larger sized firms. Also, but still, one notable achievement by PM Abe is that he managed to convince staunch conservatives to accept few tax reforms regarding women. So in terms of Suga-san's policies and cabinet, can we expect Suga-san to continue pushing for gender equality in the Japanese society while there are merely just 2 women appointed in his cabinet?
Look, I would like to be optimistic there. I would like to think that that the current ministry and the cabinet, irrespective of their own gender or age, that they see the importance of these reforms from not only a social point of view, but from an economic point of view, you know, in terms of what benefit it provides to the Japanese economy. You know, I would like to think that. I would also like to think that every effort will be made to support women who have obviously suffered probably the most in the pandemic in not only Japan but in other countries as well. Yes, the gender gap, the pay gap is needs to be addressed, but you know, I think that one of the things we have to do is we have to take men along with us in this journey. And that's a shocking phrase to have to use, but it's just actually true. You've got to have the so-called captains of industry and the ministers who might be men. You've got to have them understanding what the impact is on the men in society, as members of a family, as the, you know, to understand how the changes in that might work. So it's very important when the Minister for Environment, the younger Koizumi, said that he was going to take paternity leave. That was, you know, remarkable. He didn't get to take as much as he would have liked, I think, and it was sporadic at best. But, you know, commitment by some of the prefectural governors to push paternity leave provisions in their own regional governments has been very much welcome. I think some of the work done by corporate Japan is just remarkable. Even within the pandemic, I heard just before about the great work done by a company called Calbee, you know, the snack manufacturer, that has basically shifted completely to a work from home structure. But by doing that is allowing people to work flexibly such that they don't have to be working at a time when the kids need to be schooled or when they need to be sent to school, to education and the like. So there's much more of a focus, I think, now on flexibility. And if that would translate into flexibility in terms of work practices, and then also in terms of a more diverse workforce being employed, and therefore men and women being valued equally through pay and conditions, and then men might do more housework, then we would be in a much better place potentially. But, you know, whether that's something that we can expect and hope for in the next 5 minutes is probably difficult. I think that if the coronavirus measures that the Prime Minister has said that he will implement or get going, if they in fact have a gender lens that looks after the family and women, and particularly some of the stats around single women, single mothers, and in Japan is just awful, the lack of support that they get. So I'd hope that things will change, but I don't think it's going to change quickly. So that's me hedging my bets.
Yeah, but then I guess some of the signs of positive progress would be that today I saw a news article from the Japan Times that it was saying that nearly all of Japan's male government workers with new babies, they actually plan on taking paternity leave, which is actually seen as a good sign in terms of moving towards more flexibility in the workforce. But then as you just put it quite clearly that you are hoping there will be more changes, but then so far, to get a quick answer from you, have you seen any signs of whether or not there will be any like real permanent changes prompted by COVID-19? Because this question is actually sent in by one of our viewers before the session, so I just want to get a quick answer from you on that.
In terms of the work practices and the like, yeah, the Abenomics actually focused a lot on the reforms that needed to take place in the workplace. And by doing that, it meant that, you know, there would be a cap on overtime, for example, and that the obligation to ensure that staff went home at a reasonable hour was on the part of the manager. And in fact, if the manager continued to, you know, allow people to sort of do so many hours of overtime that they were, you know, then presenting with, you know, illnesses and what have you, then it could be, in fact, that the company and the CEO be held liable for any of the damages that might take place or to that person. So, of course, there was a real shift. There was a lot of discussion about flexibility, but nothing, I mean, some of the leading, some of the companies that took it up, as I say, very quickly. You know, the Calbys and the, you know, for example, the very diverse workforce at Shiseido, for example, or IBM, or some of the foreign companies where they've got a much a broader base of employees and the like. That it sort of tinkered away at the edges a little bit, in that, you know, it was very important that those companies undertake that, but we couldn't see mainstream Japan taking on some of those changes. Whereas I think the pandemic turned everything upside down. It meant that even though there weren't many, you know, the workplaces at home weren't sufficient for people to be doing, you know, homeschooling and teaching and working and attending Zoom meetings and the like, even though people didn't have the right Wi-Fi or laptops or desks or chairs or anything like that, then it still was a real shift in a lot more companies to be more flexible in terms of how they manage their people. And so now, of course, you've got a group of people who want to go back to work in the office and some who want to take that option of being working home. I've seen the stats show that there's the greatest migration of residents from Tokyo, or as in people have indicated that if they could work online, and if you're working in a tech business or in one of the non-Japanese companies, for example, it might be easy for you to work from a smaller, you know, a place in the country, in regional Japan. And so there's been a bigger shift of people from Tokyo than there has been into Tokyo. And that, I think, is the first time that's happened in the post-war period. So, you know, is that visible to everybody? Probably not. But the companies who are embarking on change are really taking it seriously, and they're using these circumstances from a point of necessity, I guess. They've just moved very quickly to make it different. They're having to monitor how people are managed differently, of course. You know, you've got a whole history of employment practices that would need to be changed. The performance and how you manage people's performance has to shift. There's been a lot of work being done, and every day in the Nikkei I see articles about how you shift and have a merit-based promotion system, or you know, how you prepare somebody's job description such that they aren't necessarily going to be monitored and managed and performed on the basis of whether they come at, you know, 9:30 in the morning and they stay till 9:30 at night. So there are real changes taking place, and I think it's interesting, and I think it's very important for Japan. One of the things that I think doesn't happen very well here is the story of what's happening doesn't get out. You know, I hear more stories from friends in the outside of Japan about, you know, the roller coaster where you're not allowed to scream because that'll give people coronavirus, or, you know, those type of stories get a run much quicker than something as important as the reforms that are taking place in the workplace. But perhaps that's just because it's happening in other countries as well. And once everything moves to the next stage of coronavirus, then we'll see more reporting and analysis of what these changes actually have driven.
Yeah, as you actually mentioned, this kind of work flexibility is actually quite significant in the Japanese society. That has not been reported much by the
Yeah.
international media because maybe they don't really understand how significant such change is in within the society. But then another question, it's other than COVID related, would be on PM Suga's what he's going to prioritize, because we have an audience who's asking about whether or not PM Suga will advance the question of Japanese banking regulation being so different from other major nations. Does Japan recognize that their banking sector structure holds back growth? Because of course, some people would have described it as there are too many banks in Japan, not enough profitability, and very thin margins, and there needs some consolidation. So in this case, given the current market environment, do you see PM Suga prioritizing the banking consolidation piece rather than reaching the 2% inflation target in this case then?
I think he's definitely focusing on this. And in fact, in his early statement, I think it was on the night he was elected Prime Minister, or at least not the next day, he spoke of the need for reform and deregulation in the banking sector, in particular in the regional banks, for the very reasons that you've highlighted now. Too many, carrying, very, very small margins, practices that don't necessarily drive or support local businesses and what have you. And so I would imagine that will be quick off the mark. He'll do everything he possibly can. The other thing I would say about the banks is, and I talked to some senior people at some of the mega banks in Japan, they know they need to reform. But, once again, the whole workplace reforms, the deregulation, any other structural reforms that take place all have to happen together in many ways for them to be able to do that. But we've seen reports of major layoffs, not in the pandemic, not directly related to COVID, but most definitely as part of the next couple of years planning for some of the banks, because they know that they have a very high labour cost. Because of the nature of the business of the actual banking. I have a Japanese company which I've had for many, many years, and I shifted to one of the banks because I know the chairman very well, and I know that's a ridiculous reason to move, but I like him, and I decided to do that. They have a Hello Kitty bank book, which I think is adorable, but whatever. And I then was convinced the other day to have a corporate online banking service. Now, for that, I pay 3,000 yen a month, and the payment, a remittance cost from my bank to another company, if I do it online, is 700 yen. If I go to the bank, to the actual ATM, it's 400 yen. So it's more expensive for me to do those payments online on my computer. And I have to pay 35 US a month to do that. So I've just said today, I'm not going to pay that anymore because it just seems like a folly to be doing that. But, likewise, I tried to make a payment from an Australian bank overseas today and it was $10, and I'm not saying that Australian banks are the be all and end all, but that flexibility and that ease and that digital revolution took place, and it will take place here. So yes, the Japanese banks know they have to reform. They need to bring their customers along with them. And in fact, they just announced last week that we'll have to pay 1,000 yen in the future for the Hello Kitty bank book. So you've got to love the characters on your bank book enough to pay the 1,000 yen if you really, really want to be part of the old style banking that is Japan.
Right. Yeah. But then since you just mentioned a little bit about the whole digital transformation front of the banking sector in Japan, another question that is coming through the Q&A section is about digital currency, because we've seen some of Japan's neighbors, they have started adopting and rolling out digital currency. So how is the progress on that front in Japan? Or is there any progress at all?
Well, I guess if you're a company that's involved and solely trading in digital currency, you would probably say that there hasn't been much progress in Japan. But I suspect that as the banking not deregulation, I don't know if that's fair, but as the structural reforms lend themselves to a shift in areas like this, and as the ease by which these banks can move becomes apparent to them, and they see the competitors, there'll be a big shift in that area. And, you know, some of the fintech companies that are starting to open up, Revolut, for example, you know, you've seen different, Moneytree is another Australian based, Japan-based organisation set up by an Australian here. And so there are all sorts of areas that will start to drive change, I think, and hopefully the digital currency one will be one that allows for a little bit more flexibility in and out of Japan as well. But I don't know if there's that much reform there today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, given deregulation is actually quite high on Suga-san's to-do list, one of the areas that I want to ask about is basically on the integrated resort and casino front, because I mean, currently, how would you actually describe the situation of the casino and the IR front in Japan at the moment? Because some of the developers and operators, such as Las Vegas Sands, they recently announced that they are withdrawing from Japan's consideration in May, and then Wynn Resorts, they closed their Yokohama office in August, and then also MGM Resorts, they said it would be now looking to be the minor investor in Osaka. So, and some even actually said, considering Abe's departure, the Japanese casino market may be dead before it ever had a chance to flourish, as quoted from one of the commentaries. But then we know that deregulation is something that Suga-san would like to do, and he's actually an outspoken supporter of casinos. So how do you see things will play out?
Well, I think, you know, the original idea of an integrated resort casinos in Japan meant that Japan, without a history of gaming as such, meant that it had to look at all sorts of issues about, it had to look at the social impact of the legalisation of gambling. And so a lot of work was done by the Cabinet Office to ensure that municipal organisations that might be looking to host an integrated resort in their area understood, you know, the impact on the local area in terms of, you know, gambling, debts and crime and any number of things, and also money laundering and all sorts of issues were considered. The economic impact story was always offered as a reason why it was important for Japan, and it sort of dovetailed with Japan's policy to make Japan a destination for international tourists, and to create more sort of stock for people to stay, so that if you had visitors from a number of different countries, they might come for a convention, they then might stay at the hotel that was attached to one of the casinos, and that would drive some of the high-end sort of tourism business. Obviously, with COVID, that has, you know, impacted greatly. The departure from the competition to be one of the license holders by LVS was obviously was very significant. But I think that potentially it does have to be considered in this sort of pandemic environment, because, you know, now we're going to be looking at, you know, does the integrated resort, say, for example, if you look at conventions or, you know, trade shows and the like, how are they going to be held in the future? Is there going to be a hybrid sort of capacity for people to have a, you know, an option to look online as well as to attend in person? Well, then maybe you don't need all of that square meterage for the convention floor, for example, you know, that was very much stipulated as part of the integrated resort model for Japan. So I think that there's good reason for everybody to have sort of use this downtime to look at what an integrated resort will look like in the future, how it fits in with the policy to promote Japan as a destination for high-end tourists, what is the convention business looking like, etc. And of course, as you do that, you have to look at how Japan's regional growth might be managed as well. And I know that underpinning the work done by politicians and business to have a casino in Japan was to try and ensure that one of those, or two potentially of those integrated resorts be hosted by municipal areas outside of Tokyo. And so given that Tokyo was hosting the Olympics, it wasn't seen that Tokyo needed all the focus that perhaps, and Yokohama has put up its hand. And I do know that, the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister Abe was very supportive, as was the then Chief Cabinet Secretary. I don't think we've heard any particular statements by him since being made Prime Minister, but I know that Yokohama is still considering very positively holding, being the license holder of an integrated resort. Other places that are being considered are Nagasaki and Wakayama, and of course Osaka, which was always due to sort of try and work in with the Osaka Expo 2025. So some of those bigger events and what have you were the drivers for this, but it is also part of the long-term economic recovery package of Japan, and I hope that everybody gives it due consideration.
Yeah, since you mentioned the IR front would be more of a long-term gain, but this which brings me to ask you the following question, because before Abe took power, Japan actually went through a series of short-lived premierships, and the resulting instability caused some concerns to investors around the world. So do you see any risks from a return of that kind of political instability coming back going forward?
I asked a Japan expert about this discussion that I felt that was taking place, and when Abe stepped down, and he felt that it was potentially that a lot of people consider they're comparing Japan as it is today. Well, they're looking at 2012 more, they're focusing on this sort of revolving door and what Japan was like then, but they're not taking into consideration that Japan is very different. Not just that that Japan had 7 years and 8 months of a very stable government in the form of the Abe administration, but simply that Japan now, in terms of its foreign presence, in terms of its diplomatic clout, in terms of its Japan Inc. Expansion overseas, the very cash-rich companies investing in, you name it, areas throughout the region, that Japan looks very different today than it does in 2012. And we do have Abe to thank for that and all of the support that people gave him. So I think that there is, of course, a great risk that we return to that revolving door, but any government that changes often or has to, reinvent itself through its leader, that is also going to have those same issues to face. And so I think that I think there's been great support for Prime Minister Suga. I don't know, when he's going to call an election. I don't know if he waited till next year and he wasn't able to get these things across. Would people then respond in a sort of a more referendum style and say, well, I don't think you did well enough, I want to give it to someone else? But I suspect that given the nature of some of the portfolios that he's passed around to his very talented and forward-thinking ministers, there's a succession plan potentially in place that would give us some reason to know that the potential risks being considered, or at least there's a mitigation sort of process in place, I hope.
Right. And finally, one last question I would like to cover is this question that came through the Q&A box. It's about the diversity within Japanese boardrooms, which is Japan Inc. continuing to expand foreign representation on board and C-suite, and what impact has the Nissan situation had on Japan? I'm guessing this is what the question is about.
Yeah, I'm very grateful to Sega Sammy for having appointed me as a non-executive director. I was the first woman, but I was also the first foreigner sitting on the board. And I have other colleagues who are also on Japanese listed boards, both women and men, who are non-Japanese. Obviously, corporate governance formed a major part of of Prime Minister Abe's structural reform package. There have been some changes that took place, and I think there's probably a great deal of change needed in the future to ensure that more non-executive directors on boards are brought in, foreign or otherwise, quite frankly, men or women. Because there's still obviously many listed companies that don't have any non-executive directors. It's all from the companies and the like. So I think you'll find that there will be change. But, sometimes I think the Nissan situation impacted massively on foreigners. I think that also the decision, for whatever reason it was taken, to prevent permanent residents from returning to Japan in some ways will impact on people's decisions as to whether they want to work in Japan. I think that had a major impact on Japan's soft power, and it'll be up to the Japanese government and Japan Inc. to sort of shift that reputation and bring it back. So I think there are many other reasons why people need to give proper consideration to working in Japan. But I don't know that Nissan itself, I think if we had a string of those, and of course we had Olympus before that, but I think that the desire to have better corporate governance is in place, and people understand the importance of it and the reason from an economic point of view why it's valid. So hopefully, as that change doesn't happen overnight, as that takes place, then we will mitigate some of those risks that are associated with the so-called foreigner issue.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Melanie. We'll just wait and see as for how things play out in Japan. But thanks for joining us today. We'll have to leave it there. That was Melanie Brock, CEO of Melanie Brock Advisory and Non-Executive Director of Sega Sammy Holdings. But before we go, let's quickly revisit the poll that we've run earlier and see where our audience members are seeing opportunities in the Japanese markets, given the current market conditions. Let's have a look at the results, but I'm not going to go into detail about the results, but just to say, this is it for this edition of Lynk Speaker Session. Thank you all for joining us. Lynk users will be able to catch up on all the conversation or our previous conversations on demand in Lynk Answers. You just have to log into your Lynk Answers account and go to the Lynk Insights section, and you'll be able to find all the amazing conversations we had. But we have got plenty more to come. On October 6th, Tuesday evening in Asia time, we'll be speaking with former US Consul General to Hong Kong and Macau, Kurt Tong, to unpack what's ahead in the US presidential election, as well as economic implications from either a Trump or Biden victory. But stay tuned for all the announcements about how you could secure your spot on our social media pages. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you so much for your time, and see you soon.